Hello, my name is Chad Brown, and this is my video presentation for my study proposal for Psychology 207 entitled Exploring Cultural Differences in Field Independence versus Dependence on Eyewitness Testimony. So to get us started, a common distinction that is made in cognitive psychology is between analytic versus holistic thinking. For analytic thinking, this is characterized by separating an image into its constituent parts and focusing on each part in isolation. In contrast, holistic thinking is characterized by viewing an image as a whole and attending to the relationships between different parts within that image. Analytic thinkers tend to use field independence, such that they view an object as separate from its background field. In contrast, holistic thinkers tend to use field dependence, such that they view an object as bound to its background field. Previous research has shown a clear cross-cultural distinction in field dependence versus independence, such that Westerners tend to show field independence, whereas East Asians tend to show field dependence. An early research example is the rod and frame test, where subjects have to estimate the angle of a rod that is surrounded by a square frame. The challenge behind the rod and frame test is that the frame is rotated independently of the rod, and thus provides misleading information about the rod's angle. To succeed on this task, the subject must isolate the rod from the frame in order to correctly estimate its angle. Previous research has shown that Westerners tend to do much better on this task than East Asians, which suggests that they are using field independence. Other research has also found that cultural differences in field independence versus dependence can apply to social contexts. For example, when looking at this image, we see a central figure surrounded by several people. People who use field independence would look at the facial expression of the central figure when judging the central figure's emotion. In contrast, people who use field dependence would look at the facial expression of the central figure as well as those of the surrounding people in order to make a judgment about the central figure's emotion. So after looking at this research, what I'm curious to know is whether the findings from cross-cultural research on field independence versus dependence can extend to crime-related contexts such as eyewitness testimony. To date, there has been no research exploring this possible relationship, but I contend that how individuals view and describe crime-related images is a product of field independence versus dependence, which in turn is a product of culture. For my proposed study, I hypothesize that the descriptions and eye fixations of Western participants will focus primarily on the focal point, or in this case, the perpetrator, of crime-related images, which provides evidence for field independence. In contrast, I hypothesize that for East Asian participants, their descriptions and eye fixations will be equally spread between the perpetrator and objects within the background of crime-related images, which provides evidence for field dependence. For my proposed study, 50 Western and 50 East Asian undergraduate students will view and describe several crime-related images on a computer screen. Each image will be shown on the computer screen, one at a time. In an attempt to mimic the often fast-paced nature of crime scenes, participants will only have 30 seconds to view some crime-related images and 60 seconds to describe other crime-related images. Half of the participants will first view images while wearing an eye-tracking device, as shown in this picture, to record their eye movements and fixations. Then, these participants will describe what they see in other images. The other half of participants will complete these tasks in the reverse order, such that they describe some images and then view others. This is known as counterbalancing. Viewed images using the eye tracking device will be measured as the percentage of eye fixation that focuses on the perpetrator within the 30-second period. Described images will be measured as the percentage of the description that focuses on the perpetrator within the 60-second period. If the results support my hypothesis, then Western participants will spend the greatest proportion of time viewing and describing the perpetrator within each crime-related image. If the results hold true, then I would also expect that for East Asian participants, they would spend an equal amount of time both viewing and describing the perpetrator within each image compared to objects within the background of each image. These results would suggest that Western participants are using field independence, whereas East Asian participants are using field dependence. This crime-related photo shows the eye movement pattern that I would expect of a typical Western participant. As we can see in this image, the majority of eye fixation focuses on the perpetrator's face. This crime-related photo is the same as the one that we saw before, but now with the eye movement pattern that I would expect of a typical East Asian participant. While there is some eye fixation on the perpetrator's face and body, there's also a lot more fixation on background objects, such as cars, trees, signs, and so forth. Before I close, I'd also like to discuss some strengths and limitations of my proposed study design. To start, an advantage of the study design is that it takes advantage of using both behavioral and neuroscientific methods to understand how cultural differences in field dependence versus independence influence eyewitness testimony, which is superior to using one of these methods on its own. Another advantage of this design is that it is much easier to measure verbal descriptions and eye fixations for still images rather than in moving video. On the flip side of this, a disadvantage of using still images is that they are not representative of real-life crime scenes, where an eyewitness is required to view what is going on around them in real time. Another disadvantage of the study design is that it does not mimic the emotional arousal that often takes place during crime scenes, and could thus influence where eyewitnesses look within that scene and how they describe those scenes at a subsequent occasion. In closing, I believe that this study could potentially provide a valuable insight into how crime scenes are viewed and described across culture. Furthermore, these results could potentially be used to develop more culturally sensitive interview techniques for eyewitness testimony. Thank you very much for viewing my video presentation.